Marcus Thompson had always been different from the other soldiers at Fort Bragg. While his fellow recruits spent their evenings polishing boots and comparing war stories, Marcus sat quietly in the corner of the barracks, sketching in a worn leather notebook. The intricate drawings that filled those pages would have surprised anyone who took the time to look, but nobody ever did. They were too busy focusing on the elaborate tattoo that covered most of his left forearm. The tattoo was unlike anything the other soldiers had seen. It wasn't the typical eagle, flag, or military insignia that decorated most arms in the barracks. Instead, Marcus bore an intricate design that seemed to tell a story all its own. Swirling patterns intertwined with symbols that looked almost ancient, creating a masterpiece that caught the light differently depending on the angle. At first glance, it appeared to be purely decorative, perhaps even feminine to the hardened eyes of career military men. This perception made Marcus an easy target for ridicule. Sergeant Rodriguez was particularly fond of making comments during morning formations. "Hey, Thompson, where'd you get that pretty little bracelet? Your girlfriend draw that for you?" The laughter that followed these remarks echoed across the training grounds, but Marcus never responded. He simply stood at attention, his eyes fixed on some distant point, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was holding back more than just words. The harassment wasn't limited to verbal jabs. During mess hall meals, other soldiers would deliberately bump into Marcus's left arm, claiming they were just trying to get a better look at his artwork. Some even suggested he should have gotten it removed before enlisting, calling it unprofessional and unbecoming of a soldier. Marcus endured it all with a silence that his tormentors mistook for weakness. Private Johnson, a loudmouth recruit from Texas, seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting Marcus. "You know what I think, Thompson? I think you got that tattoo to impress some girl back home, and now you're stuck with it. Probably regret it every day, don't you?" Johnson's words were always delivered with a cruel smile, designed to provoke a reaction that never came. The truth was that Marcus had indeed gotten the tattoo because of someone back home, but not in the way Johnson imagined. The design held memories that cut deeper than any insult these men could deliver. Each symbol represented something precious that had been lost, each swirling line a reminder of why he was here, why he had chosen this path. But explaining that would require sharing parts of his story that he wasn't ready to tell, parts that still felt too raw even after all these months. During training exercises, the mockery continued. When Marcus demonstrated exceptional marksmanship during target practice, hitting bullseyes that others could only dream of achieving, someone would inevitably comment that his pretty tattoo must be bringing him luck. When he completed obstacle courses in record time, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural, the jokes would start about how his decorative art was making him more aerodynamic. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. These same men who mocked his appearance were consistently outperformed by him in every measurable aspect of their training. His scores in marksmanship were so consistently high that instructors had started using him as an example for other recruits. His physical fitness test results placed him in the top percentile of all soldiers on the base. His tactical thinking during war games showed an intuitive understanding of strategy that impressed even seasoned officers. Yet none of these achievements seemed to matter when it came to the daily social dynamics of military life. The tattoo remained a source of amusement for his fellow soldiers, a visual reminder that Marcus was somehow different, somehow not quite fitting into their idea of what a soldier should be. They saw the art on his skin and assumed they understood the man beneath it, never realizing how wrong their assumptions were. Marcus's drill instructor, Sergeant First Class Williams, was one of the few people who seemed to see beyond the surface. Williams was a 30-year veteran who had served in conflicts across 3 decades. He had seen enough soldiers come and go to recognize that the quiet ones often carried the heaviest burdens. During one particularly brutal training session in the desert heat, when other recruits were complaining and some were even dropping out, Marcus continued with the same steady determination he showed every day. "Thompson," Williams had called out during a brief water break, "where'd you serve before this?" "I haven't served before this, Sergeant," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that was clearly visible in his posture. Williams studied him for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in details that others missed. "Civilian life treating you well before you joined us?" Marcus's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Williams caught it. "Yes, Sergeant. Well enough." That brief exchange planted a seed of curiosity in Williams's mind. There was something about Thompson that didn't quite add up. His skills were too refined, his knowledge too extensive, his composure under pressure too unshakable for someone who claimed to have no military experience. But Williams was patient. He had learned that the best soldiers often had the most complicated histories, and those histories had a way of revealing themselves when the time was right. The other recruits remained oblivious to these subtleties. To them, Marcus was simply the weird guy with the fancy tattoo who happened to be good at soldier stuff. They couldn't see past their own assumptions to recognize that they were sharing their barracks with someone whose background might be far more complex than they imagined. The tattoo continued to be their primary source of entertainment, at Marcus's expense. A daily reminder of how little they actually knew about the man they thought they had figured out. As weeks turned into months, the pattern remained unchanged. Marcus excelled in training while enduring constant ridicule about his appearance. He maintained his silence while his fellow soldiers maintained their ignorance. None of them suspected that the tattoo they found so amusing might actually be the key to understanding exactly who Marcus Thompson really was, and why his presence among them was far more significant than any of them could possibly imagine. The transformation began subtly, like morning mist giving way to sunlight. 3 months into their training cycle, Marcus Thompson started displaying capabilities that went far beyond what anyone expected from a new recruit. During advanced marksmanship training, while other soldiers struggled to hit targets at 300 meters with standard rifles, Marcus was consistently placing shots within the inner ring at 800 meters, making adjustments for wind and elevation that seemed to come from nowhere. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the range officer, found herself studying Marcus's performance with growing fascination. She had overseen thousands of soldiers through their training, and she had never seen anything quite like this. Marcus didn't just shoot accurately. He shot with the kind of precision that suggested muscle memory built over years of practice. His breathing technique, his stance, the way he worked the bolt action of the rifle, everything spoke of someone who had spent considerable time behind a scope. "Thompson," Captain Mitchell called out after one particularly impressive display, "walk me through your shooting technique." Marcus approached with the same quiet demeanor he showed in all interactions. "Ma'am, I focus on breathing control and natural point of aim. I try to let the rifle settle into position rather than forcing it." "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" The pause was almost imperceptible. "Hunting, ma'am. Spent a lot of time in the woods growing up." Mitchell nodded, but something in Marcus's eyes suggested there was more to the story. The techniques he was demonstrating weren't typical of recreational hunting. They showed signs of tactical training, the kind that came from specialized military schools or extensive combat experience. She made a mental note to review his file more carefully. The mockery from his fellow soldiers took on a different tone as Marcus's abilities became impossible to ignore. Private Johnson, who had been the most vocal about the tattoo, found his jokes falling flat as Marcus consistently outperformed everyone in their unit. During a particularly challenging field exercise designed to test combat readiness, Marcus had single-handedly neutralized an entire opposing squad in what was supposed to be a team-based scenario. "Lucky shot," Johnson muttered as they gathered for debriefing, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried in previous weeks. 12 lucky shots?" Private Davis asked, raising an eyebrow. "Against moving targets? In low-light conditions?" The truth was becoming harder to dismiss. Marcus wasn't just naturally talented. He was operating at a level that suggested professional training far beyond what any civilian hunter would possess. During night navigation exercises, he moved through terrain with a silence that unnerved even experienced soldiers. He seemed to know exactly where to step, how to avoid detection, when to move, and when to remain perfectly still. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had made numerous jokes about Marcus's appearance, found himself increasingly uncomfortable during training scenarios where Marcus was designated as the opposing force. In one memorable exercise, Marcus had managed to approach within 10 feet of Rodriguez's position without being detected, tapping him on the shoulder to signal his elimination from the exercise. Rodriguez had jumped so badly that other soldiers had laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that came from amusement. It was nervous laughter, the kind that came from realizing you were out of your depth. The tattoo remained a topic of conversation, but the tone was shifting. Instead of outright mockery, some soldiers were beginning to wonder if there might be more significance to the intricate design than they had initially assumed. The symbols within the tattoo seemed to carry weight, purpose, meaning that went beyond mere decoration. Some of the more observant soldiers noticed that Marcus would sometimes trace the patterns with his finger during quiet moments, as if drawing strength or comfort from the marks on his skin. During medical training, Marcus demonstrated knowledge of field medicine that impressed even the instructor, a former Special Forces medic. When presented with trauma scenarios, Marcus responded with confidence and skill that suggested hands-on experience with combat injuries. His technique for treating gunshot wounds was textbook perfect, his understanding of triage procedures was instinctive, and his ability to work under pressure was remarkable. Thompson, the instructor, asked after a particularly complex medical scenario, "You ever work as a paramedic or EMT?" "No, sir," Marcus replied, but once again his answer felt incomplete. The instructor studied him carefully. "You've got steady hands and good instincts. Natural talent, I guess." Marcus nodded but said nothing more. The instructor walked away, wondering why someone with such obvious medical skills had enlisted as a regular infantry soldier instead of pursuing a medical specialty that would have allowed him to use his talents more effectively. As training progressed toward its final phases, the contrast between Marcus and his fellow soldiers became even more pronounced. During complex tactical exercises that required coordination between multiple units, Marcus demonstrated an understanding of strategy and battlefield dynamics that impressed senior officers who observed the training. He seemed to anticipate enemy movements, predict tactical decisions, and respond to changing situations with the kind of flexibility that usually took years to develop. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, made an unusual appearance during one of these exercises. He rarely involved himself in routine training activities, but reports about Marcus's performance had reached his desk, and his curiosity was piqued. Standing beside the observation tower, Harrison watched through binoculars as Marcus's unit navigated a complex urban warfare scenario. "That soldier there," Harrison said to his aide, pointing toward Marcus. "What's his background?" The aide consulted his tablet. "Marcus Thompson, sir. Civilian background, no prior military service. Enlisted 6 months ago." Harrison lowered his binoculars with a frown. "No prior service? Are you certain about that?" "According to his file, sir. Says here he worked construction before enlisting." Harrison raised the binoculars again, watching as Marcus coordinated his team's movement through a simulated building clearing operation. The tactics being employed were sophisticated, the execution was flawless, and the leadership being demonstrated was far beyond what any new recruit should possess. "Construction," Harrison muttered. "Right." The colonel's interest in Marcus Thompson was noted by others on the base, which only added to the growing sense that there was more to the quiet soldier with the distinctive tattoo than anyone had realized. Speculation began to circulate among the training staff, theories about Marcus's true background that ranged from the plausible to the fantastic. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his daily routine, enduring the increasingly uncertain comments about his tattoo while demonstrating skills that defied explanation. He seemed unaware of the attention his performance was generating among the base leadership, or perhaps he was simply choosing to ignore it. His focus remained fixed on completing his training and moving forward with whatever plan had brought him to this place. The other soldiers in his unit were beginning to feel a mixture of respect and unease. They could no longer dismiss Marcus as simply an oddball with questionable taste in body art. Whatever jokes remained were delivered with less conviction, and some soldiers had stopped making comments about the tattoo altogether. There was a growing sense that they might have been mocking something they didn't understand, someone whose story was far more complex than any of them had imagined. The turning point came during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise in the mountains of North Carolina. Hurricane Helena had swept through the region the previous week, leaving behind flooding, downed trees, and communication disruptions that made the training area particularly challenging. What started as a standard survival and evasion exercise quickly transformed into something far more serious when real-world events intervened. Marcus Thompson's unit had been dropped into the forest with minimal equipment, tasked with reaching a designated extraction point while avoiding capture by opposing forces played by instructors and senior personnel. The exercise was designed to test their ability to navigate, survive, and evade detection over a 72-hour period. For most soldiers, it represented the culmination of months of training and their final test before graduating to active duty assignments. On the second day of the exercise, approximately 30 miles from the nearest road, Private Johnson stumbled while crossing a fallen log over a swollen creek. The water was moving faster than anyone had anticipated, and when Johnson lost his footing, the current immediately swept him downstream toward a series of rocks and fallen trees that had been deposited by the recent storm. The other soldiers in the unit froze, unsure how to respond to what had suddenly become a life-threatening situation rather than a training scenario. Johnson was a strong swimmer, but the debris-filled water and powerful current made swimming impossible. He was being carried toward a natural dam of logs and rocks that would likely trap him underwater if he couldn't find a way to get to shore. Marcus reacted without hesitation, moving with a speed and precision that caught everyone off guard. Instead of jumping into the water immediately, which would have been the instinctive response for most people, he quickly assessed the situation like someone trained to handle emergencies. His eyes tracked the current, calculated distances, and identified the optimal intervention point downstream where the terrain would give him the best advantage. "Davis, get me that rope from your pack," Marcus commanded with an authority that surprised everyone, including himself. His voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. "Rodriguez, position yourself at that bend where the current slows. Peterson, radio for medical evacuation." The soldiers responded to his commands without question, their training kicking in despite the fact that Marcus held no official rank or authority over them. There was something in his demeanor that commanded instant respect and obedience, a confidence born of experience that none of them possessed. Marcus tied one end of the rope around his waist and secured the other end to a sturdy tree, then entered the water at precisely the point he had calculated. His movements in the water were controlled and efficient, showing skills that went far beyond basic military swimming training. He intercepted Johnson's trajectory with perfect timing, grabbing the panicking soldier just as he was about to be swept into the deadly debris field. The rescue itself was executed with textbook precision, but what happened next was what truly caught everyone's attention. As Marcus pulled Johnson to shore, his wet uniform clung to his body in a way that revealed additional details about his tattoo that had previously been hidden. The intricate design on his forearm was actually part of a much larger piece that extended up his arm and across his shoulder, disappearing beneath his uniform. More importantly, as he bent over Johnson to assess his condition, the wet fabric revealed glimpses of other markings that were unmistakably military in nature. On his shoulder blade, partially visible through the translucent wet fabric, was what appeared to be a trident symbol, the distinctive emblem associated with Naval Special Warfare Command. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to notice, and his expression changed dramatically as he processed what he was seeing. The trident symbol wasn't something you could fake or obtain casually. It was earned through some of the most rigorous training in the military, marking someone as having completed Navy SEAL qualification. But according to Marcus's file, he had no prior military service. "Johnson's got a head injury and possible hypothermia," Marcus reported, his focus entirely on the injured soldier. "We need to get him warm and stabilized until the medical team arrives." His assessment was clinical and accurate, delivered with the kind of calm professionalism that came from extensive experience with combat medicine. As he worked to treat Johnson's injuries using techniques that were clearly second nature to him, the other soldiers watched in stunned silence. The medical evacuation helicopter arrived within an hour, responding to coordinates that Marcus had somehow calculated with pinpoint accuracy, despite the fact that they were supposedly operating under radio silence for the exercise. The flight crew that retrieved Johnson was surprised to find that the soldier's injuries had been managed so effectively in the field, preventing what could have been a much more serious situation. After the helicopter departed, the remaining members of the unit found themselves alone in the forest with Marcus Thompson, looking at him with completely different eyes. The jokes about his tattoo suddenly seemed not just inappropriate but potentially dangerous, as if they had been unknowingly mocking someone whose background was far more complex than any of them had realized. "Thompson," Rodriguez said carefully, "that was some pretty impressive water rescue technique." Marcus was wringing water from his uniform, his attention focused on practical matters. "Johnson's going to be fine. Good thing he didn't get swept into that log jam." "Yeah," Rodriguez agreed. "But I'm talking about your technique. That wasn't basic military swimming. That was special operations level water rescue." Marcus paused in his activities, meeting Rodriguez's eyes directly. For a moment, the mask of the quiet recruit seemed to slip slightly. revealing glimpses of someone much more experienced and potentially much more dangerous than anyone had suspected. "I spent time around water growing up," Marcus said finally. "You pick things up." It was the same type of deflective answer he had given before, but now it carried different weight. Rodriguez and the others were beginning to understand that Marcus's explanations were consistently incomplete, designed to deflect inquiry rather than provide information. Davis, who had been studying the partially visible tattoo on Marcus's arm, spoke up hesitantly. "Marcus, that design on your arm, it's not just decorative, is it?" Marcus looked down at his tattoo, and for the first time since any of them had known him, his expression showed something that might have been pain. The intricate symbols and patterns that they had mocked for months clearly held deep personal significance, representing something that went far beyond artistic choice. "It tells a story," Marcus said quietly. "What kind of story?" Peterson asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out through the trees toward where the helicopter had disappeared. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made everyone listen more carefully. "The kind of story you don't tell unless you have to." The remainder of the exercise passed in relative silence, with the other soldiers watching Marcus with new respect and growing curiosity. His demonstration of advanced skills under pressure had shattered their assumptions about who he was and where he had come from. The tattoo that had been a source of amusement was now clearly something much more significant, and the quiet recruit who had endured their mockery was obviously someone with a background that didn't match his official file. As they made their way toward the extraction point, each of them was privately wondering the same thing. Exactly who was Marcus Thompson? And why was he pretending to be someone he clearly wasn't? The atmosphere in the barracks had changed completely by the time Marcus Thompson's unit returned from their training exercise. Word of the rescue had spread throughout the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about the quiet soldier who had demonstrated capabilities far beyond what his file indicated. The mockery had stopped entirely, replaced by a mixture of respect, curiosity, and growing suspicion that Marcus was not who he claimed to be. Colonel Harrison was waiting for them when they arrived at the debriefing facility. His presence was highly unusual for a routine training exercise, but nothing about Marcus Thompson's situation had been routine for quite some time. Harrison had spent the previous day reviewing Marcus's file in detail, making phone calls to verify information, and consulting with contacts in various branches of the military to see if anyone could shed light on the mysterious recruit. "Thompson," Harrison said as the soldiers filed into the briefing room, "I need to speak with you privately." Marcus nodded without surprise, as if he had been expecting this conversation for some time. The other soldiers exchanged glances, understanding that something significant was about to unfold. They had all seen the glimpse of the trident symbol on Marcus's shoulder, and they understood the implications of what that might mean. Harrison's office was spartanly decorated, the walls lined with commendations and photographs from a 30-year military career that had taken him through conflicts on 3 continents. He gestured for Marcus to sit, then settled behind his desk with the bearing of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "Your performance during the rescue operation was exceptional," Harrison began, his tone carefully neutral. "Water rescue techniques of that caliber typically require specialized training that isn't part of basic military curriculum."
Marcus sat at attention, his expression giving away nothing.
"Thank you, sir. I've been reviewing your file, Thompson. According to your enlistment records, you have no prior military experience. You list your previous occupation as construction work in Ohio. Your emergency contact is listed as Sarah Thompson, described as your sister, with an address in Cincinnati." Harrison paused, studying Marcus's reaction. There was no visible change in the soldier's expression, but Harrison was experienced enough to recognize that perfect emotional control was itself a telling sign. "I had someone make some calls to Ohio," Harrison continued. "There's no record of anyone named Marcus Thompson working construction in the Cincinnati area during the time period you claim. The address you listed for your sister doesn't exist. In fact, there's no record of anyone named Marcus Thompson matching your description in that entire region." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Marcus maintained his composure, but Harrison could see calculations taking place behind his eyes. Decisions being made about how much truth could be safely revealed. "Sir," Marcus said finally, "my background check was completed during enlistment. If there were any problems with my documentation, they would have been identified then." Harrison nodded slowly. That's true. And that's what makes this situation particularly interesting. Someone with considerable skill created documentation that was good enough to pass initial screening, but doesn't hold up under detailed investigation. That level of expertise in document creation isn't something most civilians possess. The colonel opened a folder on his desk and withdrew several photographs. These were taken during yesterday's exercise. High-resolution images that show details of your tattoo that aren't normally visible. He slid the photographs across the desk. They clearly showed not only the intricate design on Marcus's forearm, but also the partial trident symbol that had been glimpsed through his wet uniform. The trident is the symbol of Naval Special Warfare Command, Harrison said. It's not something you can buy at a tattoo parlor. It's earned through completion of some of the most demanding training in the military. Men who wear that symbol have demonstrated capabilities that place them among the most elite soldiers in the world. Marcus looked at the photographs without changing expression, but Harrison noticed that his hand unconsciously moved toward the tattoo on his arm, fingers tracing the patterns in a gesture that spoke of habit and familiarity. The question, Harrison continued, is how someone with Navy SEAL qualifications ended up enlisting as a basic infantry recruit under an assumed identity. That's not the kind of decision someone makes lightly. For the first time since the conversation began, Marcus seemed to reach some kind of internal decision. His posture shifted slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different quality, less of the careful deference of a recruit and more of the confidence of someone accustomed to operating at a much higher level. Sir, my situation is complicated. There are aspects of my background that I'm not at liberty to discuss without proper authorization. Harrison leaned back in his chair, recognizing the language of someone who had dealt with classified operations and security clearances. What kind of authorization would that require? Contact with Naval Special Warfare Command would be a starting point, Marcus said. But I suspect that certain files related to my service record have been sealed or classified in ways that make standard verification difficult. The colonel studied Marcus with new understanding. Sealed service records typically indicated involvement in operations that were too sensitive for normal documentation. Soldiers who participated in certain types of missions often found their official histories sanitized or completely rewritten to protect operational security. Are you currently under any kind of special assignment? Harrison asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Sir, I enlisted in the Army because I needed to continue serving, but circumstances made it necessary for me to do so under a different identity. The work I did previously, it ended in a way that made returning to normal military service complicated. Harrison nodded, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. Medical discharge? Psychological evaluation? Mission gone wrong? Something like that, Marcus said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested painful memories. The tattoo. It commemorates people who didn't make it home from my last mission. Each symbol represents someone who died under my command. The admission hung in the air between them, explaining so much about Marcus's behavior over the past months. The quiet demeanor, the reluctance to discuss his background, the way he endured mockery without response. It all made sense in the context of someone dealing with survivor's guilt and the aftermath of a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. How many people? Harrison asked gently. Marcus looked down at his arm, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns. 7, my entire team. Harrison felt a chill of understanding. He had heard whispers of operations that had gone wrong, teams that had been lost in places that officially didn't exist, conducting missions that were never acknowledged, the kind of black operations that left survivors with stories they could never tell and guilt they could never share. And you blame yourself, Harrison said. It wasn't a question. I was team leader. They were my responsibility. When everything went wrong, I was the only one who made it out. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. The official inquiry cleared me of any wrongdoing, but that doesn't change the fact that 7 good men died following my orders. Harrison began to understand why Marcus Thompson had chosen to disappear into the regular army under an assumed name. For someone carrying that kind of guilt, the elite world of special operations would be full of constant reminders of what he had lost. Starting over as a basic recruit would offer a kind of anonymity and simplicity that might help him find peace. What was your rank? Harrison asked. Lieutenant Commander. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Harrison's eyes widened slightly. DVGRU was the most elite unit within the already elite Navy SEALs, the tip of the spear for the most sensitive operations the military conducted. For someone of that caliber to be serving as a basic Army recruit was almost unprecedented. "What do you want me to do with this information?" Harrison asked. Marcus met his eyes directly. "Sir, I just want to serve. I need to serve. But I need to do it in a way that lets me start over. The man I was before died with my team. Marcus Thompson is who I am now." Harrison nodded slowly, beginning to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. He had a former Navy SEAL officer serving in his command under an assumed identity, carrying guilt from a failed mission that had apparently cost 7 lives. It was a situation that required careful handling and considerable discretion. 3 days after his conversation with Colonel Harrison, Marcus Thompson found himself standing in a briefing room he had never seen before, facing a man whose mere presence changed the atmosphere in ways that made even experienced soldiers nervous. Commander Jack Sullivan wore the uniform of Naval Special Warfare Command, and the ribbons on his chest told the story of someone who had spent decades in the most dangerous corners of the world's conflicts. Sullivan was not alone. Beside him sat a woman in civilian clothes whose bearing suggested government intelligence, and a Navy chaplain whose presence indicated that this meeting would address matters that went beyond simple military protocol. Marcus recognized the setup immediately. It was the kind of gathering that occurred when the military needed to handle situations that existed in the gray areas between official policy and human necessity. "Please sit down, Marcus," Commander Sullivan said, using Marcus's assumed name rather than his real identity. It was a small gesture, but one that indicated respect for the choice Marcus had made to reinvent himself. "We've had some interesting conversations over the past few days," Sullivan continued. "Colonel Harrison contacted Naval Special Warfare Command to inquire about a soldier whose capabilities seemed inconsistent with his official background. That inquiry triggered some flags in our system, flags that led us to review files that have been sealed for the past 18 months. Marcus remained silent, but Sullivan could see the tension in his posture. Speaking about the events that had led to his current situation would require reliving memories that Marcus had been trying to escape. "Operation Falling Star," Sullivan said quietly. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow, and for the first time since they had known him, the other people in the room saw his composure crack slightly. 7 good men lost in the mountains of Afghanistan while conducting a mission that officially never happened. The woman in civilian clothes leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Dr. Skull. Sarah Chen from the Defense Intelligence Agency. I've spent considerable time reviewing the after-action reports from Operation Falling Star, and I want you to know that the official conclusion remains unchanged. No fault was assigned to the mission commander for what happened that night." Marcus's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Official conclusions don't bring back the dead." "No," Dr. Chen agreed. "They don't. But they do matter when it comes to understanding what actually happened and why." Commander Sullivan opened a file folder and withdrew several documents. "Marcus, what do you remember about the intelligence briefing you received before departing for that mission?" The question seemed to surprise Marcus. "Sir, the briefing indicated we were extracting a single high-value asset from a compound that was supposed to be lightly defended, standard snatch-and-grab operation that my team had executed dozens of times before. What you weren't told," Sullivan said carefully, "is that the intelligence came from a source who was later determined to have been compromised. The entire operation was a trap designed to eliminate your team." Marcus stared at him in shock. "What are you saying?" Chen took over the explanation. "The asset you were sent to extract didn't exist. The compound you infiltrated was actually a prepared ambush site. The enemy knew you were coming, they knew your approach route, and they knew your extraction plan. Your team was sent into a kill box based on intelligence that was deliberately false." The revelation hit Marcus with devastating force. For 18 months, he had carried the belief that his decisions as team leader had led to the deaths of his men. The guilt had driven him to abandon his identity and disappear into the anonymous ranks of the regular military, seeking some form of penance for failures that he now learned weren't his failures at all. 7 men died because of compromised intelligence," Sullivan said. "Not because of anything you did or didn't do. You kept that team alive for 6 hours against overwhelming odds before the extraction helicopter could reach you. Without your leadership, all 8 of you would have died that night. Marcus's hands were shaking now, the careful emotional control he had maintained for so long finally beginning to break down. They said it was a clean mission. They said the intelligence was solid. The intelligence appeared to be solid, Chen said. The compromise wasn't discovered until months later, after a separate investigation into other operations that had gone wrong. Your mission was part of a larger pattern of deliberately false information being fed to American forces. The Navy chaplain spoke for the first time. Marcus, survivor's guilt is a common response to traumatic loss, especially for leaders who feel responsible for their people. But guilt based on false assumptions becomes a form of self-torture that serves no constructive purpose. Marcus looked down at his tattoo, at the intricate symbols he had worn as a memorial to his fallen teammates. I got this to honor them. Each symbol represents one of my men. I thought it was the least I could do after getting them killed. It is an honor to them, Sullivan said, but not for the reasons you believed. It honors 7 men who died in service to their country, killed by an enemy who used deception rather than honorable combat. Your survival doesn't diminish their sacrifice, it validates it. The room fell quiet as Marcus processed information that fundamentally changed his understanding of the events that had shaped the last 1.5 years of his life. The guilt he had carried, the identity he had abandoned, the penance he had sought through anonymous service, all of it based on a false premise. What happens now? Marcus asked finally. Commander Sullivan exchanged glances with Dr. Chen before answering. That depends on what you want to happen. Officially, you completed your service obligation to the Navy when you were medically discharged for psychological trauma. Your current enlistment in the Army is voluntary service under an assumed identity, which creates certain legal complications but isn't unprecedented. We could arrange for your true identity to be restored, Dr. Chen added. Your service record could be corrected, your security clearance reactivated. There are positions within naval special warfare that would welcome someone with your experience and capabilities. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours before. What about Marcus Thompson? Marcus Thompson could continue to exist if that's what you prefer, Sullivan said. The documentation supporting that identity could be regularized through proper channels. You could complete your current enlistment and continue serving as an Army soldier, or you could transfer back to the Navy, or you could separate from service entirely. The choice is yours. Marcus looked around the room at the people who had gathered to give him back something he thought he had lost forever. The truth about what had happened to his team, and the possibility of a future that wasn't defined entirely by guilt and self-imposed exile. I need time to think, he said. Take all the time you need, Sullivan replied. But Marcus, I want you to understand something. The men who died that night were professionals who knew the risks they were taking. They followed you because they trusted your leadership, and that trust was justified. You brought 6 of them out alive from an impossible situation. Don't let false guilt destroy the memory of what really happened that night. As Marcus walked back to his barracks, he felt as if he were seeing the world with different eyes. The tattoo on his arm was still a memorial to his fallen teammates, but now it represented something different. Instead of a reminder of failure, it had become a symbol of honor, sacrifice, and the bonds between soldiers who had faced the ultimate test together. The soldiers who had mocked him for months were beginning to understand that they had been in the presence of someone whose service and sacrifice went far beyond anything they had imagined. The quiet recruit with the distinctive tattoo was revealed to be a hero carrying wounds that went deeper than any of them had known, and his story was finally being told in its full truth.